You're listening to Unpacked, the Truth About Hoarding, a podcast that goes beyond the mess to explore the heart, humanity, and healing behind hoarding disorder. Hosted by Matt Williams.
All right. Welcome to Unpacked, the Truth About Hoarding. And I'm your host, the commonly named Matt Williams, coming to you from our headquarters high above the Rockwellian Main Street of Irwin, Pennsylvania. And if you've found this podcast, there's a good chance you've either experienced hoarding disorder yourself or you love someone who has. Or maybe you're just curious because you've seen shows like Hoarders and thought, what's really going on here? And that's a good question. And this show exists because I think most people, including a lot of professionals, still don't really understand the answer to that. So let me start by telling you a little bit about who I am and why this podcast exists and why I hope you'll keep listening. I'm a certified peer specialist, a published author, a nonprofit founder, and maybe most importantly, I'm someone who's been through it. My journey into this work didn't start in a classroom. It started in pain and trauma. In 2009, my father was murdered during a random act of violence, and it shattered my life. And for years, I struggled with trauma and addiction, depression. I mean, just that feeling that nothing made sense anymore. But thankfully, that story did not end there. And in time, I found purpose, not in pretending to be okay, but in helping others who were not okay. So I founded a nonprofit called Fight the Blight to help elderly and disabled homeowners maintain their properties. What started as a simple yard cleanups turned into something much deeper. Behind the overgrown grass and the peeling paint, we found something much more human. We found people who were overwhelmed, and isolated, and very often they were ashamed. And more, we found people struggling with hoarding disorder. So I didn't have a degree in psychology, but I had my tools, I had a truck, and definitely a heart for people who felt invisible. And over time, I gained experience that I feel textbooks can't really teach through just hundreds of hours in real homes with real people doing real work. So today, Fight the Blight runs peer-led support groups, in-home sorting assistance, and we even work with licensed therapists when needed. And I've spoken in many areas across the country, been featured in some major national media, and I even recently published a book about my personal journey called Purpose Through Pain, a journey from tragedy to healing. But I'm just sharing that because I want you to know that this show isn't coming from a place of judgment. It's coming from lived experience and from earned trust and from a belief that the stuff we see in someone's home is never the whole story. So that's what Unpacked is all about. We're going to unpack the truth, the emotional truth of what hoarding disorder really is and what it isn't. They say every movement needs a hero and a villain. And if there's a villain in this one, it's not the people who live in cluttered homes. It's the producers of shows like Hoarders and Filthy Fortunes who have made millions turning human suffering into entertainment. These shows have done more than just raise awareness. They've definitely caused real damage. They've created false impressions. They've taught millions of people that the way to, quote, help is to throw everything away fast and film the pain. Here's what those shows don't tell you. Hoarding disorder is a real diagnosable condition. It's not just messiness. It's often rooted in trauma, grief, anxiety. There are many paths to hoarding disorder, and forced cleanouts don't help. In fact, they usually cause harm, sometimes trauma, and often result in even more accumulation later. It typically reaccumulates in those situations. So people with hoarding disorder, they're not lazy. They're deeply caring, highly intelligent, and struggling to protect the things that they believe are important, not because they're irrational, but because their reasons go deeper than most people understand. And this media stigma, it actually reduces funding possibilities for real solutions and makes people with hoarding disorder less likely to see help. We've seen that a lot. And here's the most important truth of all. Recovery is possible. It's slow and measured, and it's not TV material, but it's real. In a 2023 report to the U.S. Senate Special Committee on Aging, survivors, experts, and service providers testified that hoarding disorder is widely misunderstood and that shows like Hoarders have made it harder, not easier, for people to get the help that they need. One survivor in this report put it beautifully, I think. She said, when we get help and our spaces are cleared and organized, we have a lot happier, healthier version of ourselves to offer the world. And it isn't that what the world needs. One of the most important things I've learned through this work is that most people with hoarding disorder don't consciously understand the emotional connection they have to their things, at least not at first. In our support groups, we talk, we write, we share, and around the fourth or fifth session, something powerful usually happens. People start to realize what they're holding on to and why they're holding on. And the clutter that once seemed random or embarrassing starts to speak back to them. And when it does, healing can begin. So I remember one woman, I always think of her in this sort of conversation, who was interviewed in the MP article that was done about our work. And she had a deep attachment to cookbooks. She didn't cook, at least not any longer. She lived alone. And she couldn't even get into her kitchen at the time because of the clutter. But still, she bought cookbooks obsessively, and she couldn't bring herself to part with a single one. Then one day in group, she was sharing, and mid-sentence, she just stopped. And you could almost see the light bulb come on. And she said, my mom passed away when I was young, and my dad even earlier than that. And it was just me and her against the world. And we used to cook out of these kinds of books together. And that was it. The cookbooks were not about recipes. They were about relationships. They were about memory and connection and a time in her life when she felt safe and loved. And then she said something I won't forget. She said, but I realize if I throw away the cookbooks, I'm not throwing away my mother. And that was powerful. And from that point forward, she started letting them go, not out of guilt, but out of peace. She didn't need the stuff to hold on to the love or the memory of her mother. And that's what happens when you stop trying to force people to let go of the things and instead help them understand why they're holding on in the first place. So let's talk about the personality traits that may be surprising that I've seen most often among people with hoarding disorder, and they aren't bad traits. In fact, they're really, truly some of the best ones. Altruism, creativity, perfectionism. These are great traits, and truthfully, I've learned that people with hoarding disorder are typically some of the best people that I know, due to these traits, these very positive traits that sometimes can lead to negative outcomes like hoarding disorder and excessive clutter. Let's start with altruism. On its own, it's a beautiful thing. But when unexamined, it can turn into pathological altruism. And that's when someone holds on to hundreds of items, not because they want them, but because they can't bear the idea of someone else not having them. And it's not about greed. It's not about selfishness. It's about too much caring without boundaries. And next up that I mentioned is hypercreativity. Some of the most brilliant artistic minds I've encountered see potential in everything. A tangle of wires, a broken lamp, a stack of paper towel rolls. But when everything has potential, nothing gets discarded. The space to create gets buried under the pressure to save it all. And finally, perfectionism, not the neat kind, the paralyzing kind. I'll sort this when I have the right bins, the time, the energy, but that time never comes, so nothing moves. And that perfectionism, which is born from the fear of getting it wrong, getting something wrong, anything wrong, becomes a barrier to even trying. So what do they have in common? They're all rooted in goodness, but twisted by trauma, isolation, internal pressure, they can become overwhelming. And that's why the question we need to ask isn't what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. Because when we ask that and really listen, that's where the healing starts. But there's one more piece, and that's connection. Hoarding disorder isolates people. It fills their homes and empties their calendars. They stop inviting people over. They stop reaching out. They live behind a wall of things and very often shame. But in our support groups, that begins to change because for the first time in years, they're in a room where nobody's judging, where everyone understands, where they can say the things that they've never said aloud and be met with nods and not gasps. They begin to form friendships and they socialize. They support one another, not despite their shared diagnosis, but because of it. And that's the power of peer connection. That's the difference compassion makes. And so after everything we talked about, the emotional roots, the hidden strengths, the connections, the support, I hope it's even more clear why these shows, they really need to stop because they aren't just misinformed, they're dangerous. They convince the world that hoarding is a TV-worthy mess, not a complex human struggle. They make people feel ashamed of needing help. They teach families to attack the symptoms instead of addressing the cause. And they bury the truth under dramatic music and before and after photos. But here's what I've seen in the field, in the groups, in the hearts of the people who've been written off. Real healing doesn't happen when the cameras are rolling. It happens in quiet conversations and in shared stories and in connection and community. And it happens when someone says, I see you, instead of, I'm here to fix you. And that's what this podcast is about. So if that's what you're about too, I hope you'll stay with me because we've got a lot more to unpack in the coming episodes.
Thanks for listening to Unpacked, the truth about hoarding. For more information or support, visit fighttheblightinc.com. We'll see you next time.